our group. If you have any questions at any time, please use the chat and we'll come to them at various points and at the end. And yes, Judy, Payne, thank you for joining the Knowledge and Community Network today.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you, Nancy and Michael, for inviting me to talk. It is an honour and a privilege. Little tiny bit about me. I've been involved in knowledge management since about 1991, when I joined a fantastic organisation called Syria that's still going, and it's all about facilitating collaboration and sharing knowledge to improve the construction industry. So I joined as a water engineer leading research projects, but by the time I left I was hooked on KM and collaboration, and I've focused on KM and collaboration ever since. In the last few years I've got particularly interested in KM in project environments, and that all started with the Henley KM Forum research project, where a group of us worked out that project managers and knowledge managers have quite different mindsets and find it difficult to communicate. Which I think is what Nancy was saying. It's really difficult to get the two to work together. The mindset problem goes something like this. What we didn't work out was what to do about it, how to solve this problem, and that's been bugging me ever since. So a lot's happened since that Henley project. And in the last 6 years, knowledge management has appeared in 3 influential project management guides: the APM Body of Knowledge, the Axelos P30 Manual, and the PMI's PMBOK guide. But it isn't quite knowledge management as I know it, even though I contributed to 2 of them. So to cut a long story short, I ended up working with 2 project management friends, Steve Simister, who I'd worked with at Henley, and Eileen Roden, who I met through APM. We're working on a book about KM in project environments. And this has been really hard to write because we had to delve quite deep into each other's subjects before we could make any sense of it. And I'm going to share with you some of the ideas and insights that we've developed for the book, focusing on 2 angles: some KM principles and the state of KM in project management. But first, a poll which will help me understand which bits to whiz through and which bits to spend more time on.
Great, thanks Judy. So hopefully everyone now can see a question on their screens above the slides, and it's asking you, we just want an indication on what sort of person do you, which category do you fall into? Perhaps you're a project manager with an interest in knowledge management, or you're a knowledge manager with an interest in project manager, or perhaps none of them. Maybe you're a community manager with an interest in knowledge and project management, or a combination of any of the above. I'll give you a few more seconds. I've just noticed there was a none field, but I can't see that on the poll, so I wonder if I
can see it, Nancy.
Oh, can you? Maybe no one's picked it and that's why it's not. Maybe that's why it's not coming up. Give you a couple more seconds. If you can give cast your votes, and then I'll share them and we'll get a feel for who's on the call this afternoon.
Well, it's quite reassuring that everybody's interested.
Right, so we can see, hopefully everyone can see the results now. So very few project managers, mostly knowledge managers with an interest in project management, and then a few combination and community managers. Does that give you a good feel for the group, Judy?
Yeah, it does. That's good. So the webinar is basically in 2 halves, and the first half is just generally about knowledge management. So I hope that there's something in it for everyone.
And I'll ask some views on that during the chat while you're continuing, Judy. Thank you.
Okay, so starting with the absolute basics, what is KM? Any of you who've ever tried to explain KM to somebody who's never heard of it knows how difficult it is. Definitions don't really work. This is one of the better ones, especially because it makes it clear that the purpose of KM is to improve some organisational outcomes, but it doesn't really get the message across. And I think it's difficult because KM is quite complex. It involves people for a start, and everything in KM depends on everything else. What works in one situation doesn't necessarily work in another, so KM recipes don't work. So for complex subjects like KM, guiding principles are quite a well-known way of getting the message across. So for the book, we came up with 7 KM principles, things that apply to KM everywhere, in an organisation, in a single project, in a portfolio of projects, or between organisations. And I'm going to run through the principles. Even though we produced the principles for the book, it was basically writing down what I already knew, what I learned over the last 30 years. So it's not something we created for the book, and it's something that I'm sure most of you, especially the knowledge managers, will be aware of already. And there are other sets of KM principles around, and they are all remarkably similar, including some KM principles in the new knowledge management standard that's going to be published, I think, later this year. Because we all pooled our existing sets of principles. And so not surprisingly, what we came up with was quite similar to what I'm going to run through. So principle number 1. Principle number 1 is be clear about what you want to achieve with KM. So knowledge itself has no inherent value. It becomes valuable when it's used to do something that matters to an organisation. And KM fits in the middle. So KM unlocks the potential value of knowledge by making sure it contributes to something that matters. So it's a means to an end. And this is one of the reasons that KM recipes don't work. Different things matter to different organisations. Still on principle number 1, KM can create value in 2 different ways, by supporting the creation of new knowledge and by supporting the use of existing knowledge. And everybody needs both. All organisations need both. A single project needs both, and I'll come back to that. And the reason that these 2 different ways that KM can add value is important is because different kinds of working environment support the 2 kinds of knowledge work. So I'll be coming back to that quite a lot as we go through the webinar. Principle number 2. Develop working definitions of KM. So the bad news is that there are no universally accepted definitions of knowledge or KM. So when we talk about knowledge and KM, we're not necessarily talking about the same things. There are also lots of different names for KM. In project work, KM is sometimes called lessons learned, and it's only used in project management. But it doesn't always mean KM. Sometimes it refers to a specific technique of collecting lessons in a database, which is not my favourite KM method, for reasons that I hope will become clear. The good news is that when the ISO standard is published, incidentally, systems in that standard title, knowledge management systems, is a management system. It is very definitely not any sort of IT or information management system. So when that's published, I hope that we'll be talking about the same things, because there will be an international definition of knowledge and explanation of knowledge management. And we've also got a new edition of the APM body of knowledge coming. Knowledge management in the current edition is not brilliant. Actually, it's not very good at all. And I hope, and the knowledge SIG, of which I am a member, has contributed some text about knowledge management, which we hope will be used. So we hope the new edition will deal with KM rather better than the existing edition. And together, I hope that those 2 publications will start to break down some of the confusion that there is around knowledge management. So following on from principle number 2, one of the most common mistakes in KM is managing information and calling it KM. If you think of KM as writing things down and sharing them, the chances are that you're managing information rather than knowledge. Whenever you try to capture knowledge, a bit of it escapes, and the bit that escapes is usually the context. And I've got a little story to illustrate this point. This is a true story. I once found a recipe on the internet for chutney. And the recipe said, cut the tomatoes in half and put them outside for an hour. What the recipe didn't say was why, which was to dry them. Another bit of contextual information missing from the recipe was that the recipe was written in a hot, dry country. If you put tomatoes outside in the UK in February, which is what the recipe told me to do, you'll end up with frozen tomatoes or maybe just cold, wet tomatoes. So this is another reason why KM recipes don't work. The recipe writer for the chutney didn't mean to miss out those two important bits of contextual information. It's just extremely difficult to imagine every possible scenario in which a recipe might be applied. A little bit more about knowledge and information. If you think that knowledge is a thing that can be captured, I've called this thing thinking. If you think that knowledge is a thing that can be captured, you'll end up managing information management. Now, information management's important. You do need to write things down. You do need to partially capture knowledge in various different ways, but it certainly isn't the whole story. So knowledge is more of a process of knowing than a thing that can be captured. And it's a social process. It happens between people. And so KM involves interactions between people, not just to share knowledge and to use it, but also to create new knowledge by generating and building on ideas. And there's also a part of knowing that comes only from practical experience. And you could actually argue, and it's on this slide, that project work is based on this idea. You get people with different knowledge, different experience together to solve a problem or meet a need. And I've called this doing thinking. Principle number 4, this is important. Principle number 4 is create different working environments for the two different kinds of knowledge work. Now, the argument for working environments goes something like this. Knowledge is intangible. It can't be managed directly. And the wheelbarrow is there because you can't put knowledge in a wheelbarrow and move it around. Second part of the argument is that sharing and learning are voluntary processes. We can't force anybody to share what they know, to contribute ideas, or to learn from others. And the final bit of the argument is, it doesn't matter what fancy tools and techniques are available, they won't work unless people are motivated to engage with knowledge management. So it follows from that KM tools and techniques aren't the most important aspect of KM. Of course, we need some KM tools and techniques, but the working environment has to support the tools and the actual knowledge sharing. So a little bit more about the working environments. The two different kinds of knowledge work, using existing knowledge and creating new knowledge, need different working environments. Using existing knowledge works well in an environment of standard processes, control, and order. And that's what a lot of people think of as a typical project environment. Creating new knowledge at the other end of the spectrum needs an environment of shared purpose, autonomy, and trust. A typical creative environment to most people, but not necessarily one that you'd think of as a typical project environment, or even one that you'd find in a project-based organisation. And these two kinds of working environment, to do the two kinds of knowledge work, they require different leadership and management skills, which makes it difficult to be good at both of them. And the way organisations usually deal with this conundrum of needing to do two different kinds of knowledge work is to separate creative work from the more routine work. And we'll come back to this because this is hugely important in projects. Principle number 5. Principle number 5 is to focus on the big KM picture rather than the detailed tools and techniques. One of the most common questions I get, especially from project managers who are new to KM, is what KM tools work best. And I hope you've got it by now, that tools and techniques aren't a good starting point for KM. Understanding what you're trying to achieve, the outcomes, that's principle number 1, and creating a working environment, principle number 4, they come first. Then there are a whole host of other considerations, including definitions and shared understanding from principles number 2 and 3. And there are also places where knowledge gets stuck, and these are known as knowledge boundaries, very important in projects for reasons that we'll get to in the second half of the webinar. And things like roles and responsibilities for KM, because knowledge is intangible and KM is invisible. You need something tangible to remind people that it exists. Otherwise people might just forget to do it. If it slips off the radar, it might not happen. Rather than focusing on specific tools and techniques, it's better to think of high-level characteristics of the tools and the techniques. And this slide just shows that all knowledge management methods are basically ways of getting people in together to interact or connecting people to information in some way. And of course, that's the information management end of things. Some of the high-level characteristics of KM tools are the degree of interaction. Now, this is not the same as if you have a workshop, that doesn't automatically mean that there's a high degree of interaction. It depends on how the workshops run. If you have a meeting where everybody reads out their monthly report, that's not much interaction, even though obviously there is potential for interaction in a meeting. Whether or not some knowledge sharing is supply or demand driven is another high level characteristic. KM methods can also be formal or informal, and depending on what media you use, different richnesses of communication. And broadly speaking, the more knowledge creation that you're trying to do at any one time, the richer and more interactive the knowledge management methods need to be. Principle number 6. Principle number 6 is experiment, use feedback, and adapt. Because knowledge management can't be reduced to a neat systematic process where you follow some predefined steps, a recipe, and get guaranteed success. There's a huge element of feedback. Now, the principles 1 to 5 that I've already run through quickly, they provide some clues as to why this is the case. Knowledge management needs to be linked to organisational needs, to do something that matters, to solve a problem maybe. Knowledge management creates value in different ways, which needs different sorts of environment, and there are different perspectives on knowledge and knowledge management. So it's hugely complex. For these reasons, although knowledge management does have to be planned, especially in projects, knowledge management does have to be planned, but it also needs to be driven partly by feedback. And to generate feedback, a bit of experimentation is needed. And this slide shows if you do some knowledge management, assess the outcomes. If it's not quite what you want, you've got 3 options, and you sometimes need to go right back to the beginning. So you could just make some small changes to the KM methods. That would be single loop learning. You could go back and look at the context, the environments, and that would be applying some of the principles. That would be double loop learning. Or you might even go right back to your understanding of the KM principles, and maybe even invent some more principles that are needed in your context, and that would be triple loop learning. Principle number 7, right, this is the last of the principles, and beware of elephant traps. The elephant traps are just what you fall into if you don't follow the other principles. So I'll leave that on the screen, and in a moment I'm going to move on to the second half of the webinar, the bit about KM in projects and the state of KM in projects. But first, another poll. So over to Nancy.
Hi, thanks Judy. And there's lots of interaction going on the chat at the moment. People confirming what their experience is of KM in projects. Some not very much, and some some good examples. Bit of a discussion about Prince 2, which I think I'll come back to at the end, Judy, if there's time to ask your opinion on it. But for now, I'm going to launch the next poll, which you should have on your screen now. Is, in your experience, does KM happen in your organisation's project work through the life cycles, or perhaps at fixed points, or hardly or not at all? You can all take a moment to think about that and share with us your view. I'll give you a few seconds, but yeah, no, look, I think the principles were particularly appreciated, Judy. I think that's why it was well said. So thank you for confirming that. Right, a couple more seconds. I think we're nearly there. Cast your vote before I close the poll. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to close it now and share with you all the results. So we can see that not many are through the whole project and program life cycle, a bit more at fixed points, and majority of the group that are on the call today, it's hardly or not at all. So does that help you, Judy, with the next bit?
It does.
Thank you.
And I've actually just realised something, because I'm going to talk in a moment about some KM that's hidden in projects, but there's a clear message there. That something that's called KM or recognised as KM doesn't happen very much, and if it does, it's not very often all the way through projects, which is of course where it's needed.
Great, thank you for that.
Thank you everyone for those answers. So right, ooh, come on, right. So I'm going to start by having a look at a single waterfall project, and this is what I thought would happen, and I'm very pleased that you've confirmed it. So there are some KM activities in most projects, some things that are recognised as KM. So a requirement at the end, probably, to populate a lessons learned database. That's the most common one. If you're lucky, there's a matching requirement at the start of a project to look in the lessons learned database before you do anything. But surprisingly often, that matching requirement isn't there. You might have reviews at the end of each stage, or you might have more reviews than that in a project. And they might be recognised as something to do with knowledge management. And you might have some other useful KM techniques dotted around in there, maybe some after-action reviews to encourage learning and reflection during the execution stage. And I'm a big fan of AARs, and I put that in especially for Paul. But still, in this picture, these are fragments of KM, and some of them are more information management than knowledge management. So that's the visible knowledge management in a project. Now let's look at the hidden knowledge management. So this is stuff that happens, but that isn't usually recognised as knowledge management. So as the project goes through its life cycle, the strategic knowledge management purpose changes. So I think I've remembered the builds, right? Yeah, at the concept stage, and I put a little create new knowledge and use existing knowledge colour code key at the bottom there of the slide. So at the concept stage, you're creating new knowledge. Mostly knowledge about what the project has to achieve. Because nobody knows at the very start of a project what the project's going to be like, you know, exactly what it's trying to do, or so that's the what of the project, and nobody knows how the project is going to be done either. So that's creating some new knowledge. And we go on to the planning stage. In the early planning stage, there is a little bit more new knowledge is created. This time it's not so much about the what, it's more about the how of the project, decisions about how to deliver the rest of the project usually. And then later in the planning stage, the knowledge that's just been created is turned into a project management plan. So that's using the knowledge that exists, but only just. During the execution stage, the plan is followed. This is the perfect theoretical project. Of course, they're not really like this. During the execution stage, the plan is followed, and that's using the existing knowledge, the knowledge that is in the plan. Of course, there is some knowledge creation in the execution stage too, which I've made, so I've made it spotty. But this is different knowledge. This isn't knowledge about how to do the project. That's all been planned already. This is knowledge about the project outputs, and it's experience of the project outputs as they are developed people understand them and can experience them. And it's also experience of doing the project. So there is some knowledge creation, but in terms of how to manage the project, mostly what happens in the execution stage is following the plan using that existing knowledge. At handover, the project team has a lot of knowledge about the project and the outputs of the project, but the outputs are being handed over to people who probably haven't been heavily involved. Again, that's a sweeping generalisation, but quite often that's the case. And these people need to understand the outputs from the perspective of what they're going to do with them, how they're going to use the outputs. So that means that the people that are receiving the project outputs, they have to create some new knowledge. And then the same in the benefits realisation stage. More new knowledge needs to be created in the benefits realisation stage, this time by users of the outputs. And this is the doing sort of knowledge, the kind that comes only from experience of the outputs, whatever they are, because there's a big difference between imagining what it's going to be like to use a new product or follow a new business process, whatever the outputs of the project are. Big difference between imagining it at the start and then actually doing it. So why is that important? Well, the reason it's important is these two different environments. So the environment needed for creating new knowledge about what a project's going to be like and how it's going to be, how it's actually going to be run is quite different from the environment that you need when you get to the late planning and the execution stage. And so are the KM activities. In the concept stage, you're probably going to be doing things like multi-stakeholder workshops, highly interactive things to try to tease out exactly what the stakeholder requirements are. By the time you get to the execution stage, you're probably doing more information management. You'll be holding regular team meetings. You might have a collaborative workspace where you share information and have discussions about it. And at project closure, you might go into a very reflective mode to make collective sense of your experience in a lessons learned or some sort of a review workshop. And these are all examples of activities that aren't usually recognised as knowledge management in project environments. So here's some more hidden knowledge management, this time in the form of knowledge flows and knowledge boundaries. So the grey arrows indicate knowledge flows. The knowledge that's created in each stage of the project has to flow to the next stage. And the knowledge created in the planning stage, so this is the knowledge about how to do the project, has to flow to all the subsequent stages. The main mechanism for passing this knowledge between stages is usually project documents, and this is rarely enough. Remember the chutney recipe. Knowledge doesn't flow using documents, it flows between people. So relying on documents alone means some important bit of contextual information is going to be left out or misunderstood. Waterfall projects also create knowledge boundaries, and these are the yellow warning triangles. This happens because different groups of people are involved in different stages of the project. And the big boundary, the biggest triangle, is quite often between the project and business as usual. So in the benefits realisation stage, especially because the project team's knowledge usually walks out of the door when the project, a project closure. And this is why it's a good idea to involve users early in the project. It's to overcome that particular knowledge boundary. So the general message there is that continuity of people is better than documents. So what I've described here are some very common project management issues that aren't usually thought of as knowledge issues or as knowledge management issues. And finally on the slide, knowledge boundaries can also develop within stages. So in the execution stage, when the team is usually up to its full strength, so a lot of new people join the team, you quite often have people from lots of different disciplines working together. And if they're from different disciplines, they may not have a common technical language to work together. That can cause a knowledge boundary. And at benefits realisation, the boundary could be because people aren't motivated to learn about a new product or a new way of doing things. That could be the cause of the knowledge boundary there. Waterfall projects do, however, have a big potential advantage for knowledge management. Because a waterfall project is separated into stages, the creation of new knowledge is pretty much separated by stages from the use of existing knowledge. So even in that spotty execution stage, the knowledge about how to do the project doesn't change very much. The knowledge that's created in those grey spots is about the project outputs. This is important because it means that different working environments for different project stages can be created. So it's a way of separating the creative work from the routine work. It's also possible to anticipate the knowledge boundaries and take action to prevent them from developing so that the knowledge flows where you want it to. So with a waterfall project, it's all in the planning. You have to do some knowledge management all the way through, different kinds of knowledge management all the way through a project life cycle. But the planning at the same time in the concept and planning stages is a big effort to plan not just the knowledge management activities for the different stages and the different sorts of work, but also plan the environment. Now, I say that very glibly, but how do you actually plan the environment? And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because I just wanted to say that we have thought about it, and there will be more about it in the book. The decisions made about the way a project is going to be managed are what make the difference. So the things that are on this slide, the physical environment, the virtual environment, the way, the governance style, the assurance style, the culture, the leadership style is huge. The way the project manager behaves and interacts with the team and stakeholders makes a huge difference. You can also create local working environments for specific knowledge management activities. So if you've got a workshop with a facilitator and say you're trying to generate options for a project, the facilitator could choose a relaxed, informal, physical environment for the workshop and set ground rules and create a relaxed, inclusive atmosphere. So the way that waterfall projects in particular are done, it's an opportunity to create working environments that suit the work. The thing to avoid is allowing the business as usual environment to spill over into project work, because if that happens, you've missed the opportunity. So far we've looked at waterfall projects where the stages separate the creation of new knowledge from the use of existing knowledge. Agile is another way of getting the two kinds of knowledge work into a single project. So in Agile, on the bottom half of the slide, you cycle between creating new knowledge and using existing knowledge. So you start off with a need, a concept, and a bit of planning. But the planning is basically, this is how we're going to do this. Well, it's the decision that we're going to do this as an Agile project. And then this is how we're going to run the Agile project. So Agile has a potential huge advantage, which is it eliminates those knowledge boundaries between stages, including the big knowledge boundary between the project and business as usual. But it's very difficult to do Agile well unless you have highly committed stakeholders, highly committed and flexible project team, and very skilled leadership. In practice, Agile is sometimes chosen for the wrong reasons. Because it's difficult to create all of the new knowledge in the concept stage and the planning stage, it's difficult to work out what stakeholders really need, or because the project manager might be under pressure to start the project. In other words, get to the execution stage, which is not the right way of looking at the project because the project starts with concept. Agile is sometimes used as an excuse for avoiding the hard work of creating that new knowledge at the start of the project. If you choose Agile for any of those reasons, you'll just end up going round in circles and getting nowhere. So this isn't an argument against Agile. Agile can be great. For example, if the external environment is changing so fast that stakeholder requirements will be out of date as soon as they've been defined. But it is very difficult, and don't do it for the wrong reasons. You can always use some Agile methods and some Agile thinking in the concept and planning stages of a waterfall project. It's not a one or the other choice. And of course, you can involve users early to prevent that big knowledge boundary from developing. So, a quick recap of where we are now. So where something that's recognized or called KM, something visible exists, it's usually in fragments. It usually happens at the end of projects and programs. It's quite often focused on sharing lessons about how to do project management, which is using existing knowledge. Project management loves documents. It's all more information management than knowledge management, and the all-important working environment bit is missing. And then there's the hidden knowledge management in projects. And a lot of project management practice and theory has a knowledge management basis, but isn't recognized as knowledge management. New knowledge is created in projects, existing knowledge is used in projects, and a lot of common project management issues can be explained as knowledge issues. If I was really cynical, I'd say that we've got some information management that's called knowledge management and some real knowledge management that isn't recognized as knowledge management. Sweeping generalizations, I know, and obviously there are exceptions. But whatever way we look at it, I don't see many KM principles, not just the ones that haven't been published yet that I wrote, but the accepted KM principles, which is what the ones that I spoke about earlier based on. I don't see them, I just don't see them being applied in project environments. So there's a massive opportunity to make that hidden KM conscious and visible, and apply some KM principles to make projects more effective, not to do lots of extra work, but just to do a different way of looking at the things that are some of the work that's done in projects that will make projects more effective. So where do we go from here? One option is to build knowledge management into a single project or into a program. And this is done by applying the knowledge management principles throughout the extended life cycle, including benefits realization. If you miss that out, you're missing out that huge knowledge boundary. And so this involves doing some knowledge management and planning some future stage knowledge management, as I described it earlier. And of course, it isn't just the activities that you plan, it's also the working environments. Who can do it? Well, building knowledge management into a single project is within the sphere of influence of a project manager or a knowledge manager, working with a project manager for the knowledge managers amongst you. It's likely to increase the chances of project success, but it does have some limitations, which I think are mostly fairly obvious. There is a risk of duplication and fragmentation of practices if more than one project does it at the same time. There isn't any clear connection or feedback route to the project management framework. So lots of people are experimenting and not necessarily talking to each other and pooling what they've learned. Knowledge, of course, this is the big one, doesn't necessarily flow between projects. If you build knowledge management into a single project, you've got all that advantage, but you might not have the advantage of knowledge sharing between projects, and you're on your own. And it can be quite lonely, and it can be difficult to persuade people to work in a different way. At this point, somebody usually says to me, how do you demonstrate the benefits of knowledge management so that they can justify doing it? You don't have to justify the benefits. You don't have to demonstrate the benefits of knowledge management. Everyone who works in projects is doing knowledge management already. You don't have to demonstrate the benefits of something you're doing already. You just do it more effectively. And in any case, in a project, who demonstrates the benefits of risk management or benefits management? It's just accepted. Knowledge management isn't quite that established yet, but that's the place to aim for. So you just do it. You don't even need to tell anyone you're doing it, although it's probably better if you do. Another option, not just a single project, but introducing portfolio-wide knowledge management. And actually the two options aren't either or. If you want to introduce knowledge management across a whole portfolio or somewhere in between a portfolio and a project, it's a good idea to start with one or two pilot projects, build on existing good practice and find out what works best. And where you start depends on your sphere of influence and your sphere of interest. So introducing portfolio-wide KM involves building knowledge management processes into the organisation's project management framework, standard processes, and providing support to projects and programmes. The scale of portfolio-wide KM usually also makes it worth creating some common environments for different kinds of knowledge work. For example, all projects and programmes need that creative environment at the start, unless they're bog standard repeat projects. They need that creative working environment at the start so that people can really think hard and work together to work out what it is that you really need from the project, not the first thing that pops into your head, you know, that difficult bit. Who can do it? Well, a PMO can do it, a portfolio level PMO, or whoever in the organisation is responsible for looking after owning the project management framework, you know, all of the methods, the manual, for supporting project management, and for doing portfolio for management. So the big advantage of portfolio-wide knowledge management is that it includes sharing knowledge between projects and programs and beyond, with business as usual, for example, through knowledge management activities with stakeholders. It takes time for KM thinking and practices to become embedded in day-to-day work, but it will happen eventually if it's practiced. So I'm going to end my final slide. Make sure there's time for some, look at the chat and some questions. This is my KM dream. This is a project environment in which knowledge is created and flows within and between projects, programs, and business as usual, probably with the support of a portfolio level PMO of some kind. And all it takes, okay, this is quite a lot. It's not a small all, is to make the hidden knowledge management conscious, make it visible, and apply some knowledge management principles. The big message is start from wherever you can. So thank you for participating. And I'm going to hand back to Nancy, and we're going to have a look at the chat, Nancy.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you, Judy, first of all. That was fantastic. Lots of thoughts came into my mind as I was listening to you this afternoon. One thing I'd just like to add, I think one of the biggest successes I had during the Cadbury days was when we built that conversation through the project management piece. So at the beginning, before you start anything, who have you had a conversation with became a mandatory question at like the project board. So rather than what I've seen in the chat is people confirming this sort of tick box mentality. And actually when we change that to being a conversation and people would challenge, you know, not just who have you spoken to, what did you learn, before, during and after, really made a really big difference in sort of learning through projects. The consensus in that there's the three questions that we've asked this afternoon, there's some different views. There is obviously, as the poll confirmed, not as mature as we would have liked, but also recognising that it's a team effort, not just the project manager, and even when it is done, perhaps there's even some censorship around what is shared. So I think that's quite interesting, and sort of supports your point about not just doing it, but doing it effectively. But everyone agrees it sort of has to be built into the flow. There were some big supporters for Agile and some questions a lot about Prince 2. And maybe I should just focus on that for now while we've got a couple of minutes. Judy, what your opinion is? So the knowledge managers were asking, should they become qualified in Prince 2? And some of the group were saying that they had it and it helped. I don't know if you have an opinion on that one specifically.
I don't, I'm not Prince 2 qualified, so I mean, I know what it is, I know it's based on principles. I don't think that any project management training really helps people look at project management through the knowledge lens, which is what I've done with my project management co-authors for the book. We're still in the state in projects where most project managers are told the way to share knowledge is to have a lessons learned database, and that's it. So I'm not sure that it would help. And I think this is the reason. This is the reason that knowledge management is in the state that it's in project management. It's a sort of a vicious circle, that the training that project managers get, it reinforces some, how can I put it politely? it reinforces some myths, and one of them is that knowledge management in a project environment is different from knowledge management everywhere else. It's not. Why would it be different? It involves people, it involves learning. In fact, it's easier. But I'm not sure. But if other people have found, I'm guessing, Nancy, I can't actually see the chat, Nancy, but I'm guessing that the people who found Prince 2 useful are knowledge managers who want to get into the project management mindset a bit. And for that purpose, yes, it certainly would be. It would be useful.
And Jo's just added that actually Six Sigma was more valuable for her compared to Prince 2. So, I mean, it's different for different organisations. But I think what I heard you just say then is to understand and share the same language. So if by doing Prince 2, you can then talk to them in a language that they connect with, and you can, like you say, make it more effective by the tools and techniques that you know from a KM point of view or through that KM lens, that's got to be beneficial for all. But I mean, the thing that annoys me is that we're all in it for the same thing. The project managers want to be successful and deliver great results from their projects. So we're only supporting and enhancing, hopefully, the outcomes of their projects, which is why I don't understand the them and us sometimes, which I've experienced sometimes in the past.
Well, I think the language, it's not just the language, it's the language is a huge part of it, Nancy. I think but it's also the whole mindset. For a knowledge manager, and this was the situation that I was in until a couple of years ago when we decided to write the book. As somebody with a background and lots of experience in knowledge management, but only even though I've worked in projects for all my career, it wasn't really formal project management. So and it was also research projects, which are different. So getting under the skin into the mindset of project managers is important. And of course, being able to speak their language and then talking to them about it. But also, if you're a knowledge manager trying to get knowledge management to work better in projects, you do need to be aware that some project managers, not because they're stupid or because they've got closed minds, but because this is what they've been told. It's become the norm in project management. They think that knowledge management in projects is different somehow, and it's not.
Yeah.
So you have to, you can't
work with that. Yeah.
You have to work with that. You have to help. You have to talk their language to help them understand the knowledge management side. And by doing that, you learn about the project management side.
And that's where it looks like there's a lot of love on the chat for the KM principles and just helping them articulate, this sort of shared interest and and create that common language. So there's everyone is saying that the words that you've described is going to be incredibly helpful for them. So before we close, can we just launch the final poll and get a sense check from everyone who's still on the call on how you found today's webinar? I think Judy's been great at sharing her insights and some ideas and tips on what we can go away and do differently. But we want to hear from you. If not necessarily on the poll, you can contact us afterwards or continue the discussion in the LinkedIn group. As I say, we're all practitioners trying to connect and improve KM and CM in all the organisations that we operate in even. Okay, a couple more seconds if you can cast your votes. Any further questions? Any burning questions on the chat for Judy before we close? So I'll close the vote. So one person didn't find it very helpful, which is fair enough, but majority, well, everybody else has found it helpful or incredibly helpful. So that's a fantastic. Oh, sorry, I haven't didn't press the sharing button. I just stopped the poll. So you can see, and as I say, this is a great conversation piece. I encourage all of you to, take what you've heard today back in your teams and, continue talking with us. We want to make this as effective as possible. So I'll do a collective thank you from all of us. Judy, for your great insights this afternoon.
Well, I'm looking at the chat now, which is why my slides have disappeared. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for all the positive comments. Nancy, will I still be able to see the chat when the webinar ends?
Yes, so I'll be able to share that with you, Judy, and you can, you know, pick up anything if you want specifically back in the LinkedIn group. We've done that before.
I will certainly do that. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, the different points of view, and you know, and that we're, you know, some of us are facing very similar challenges. So I think what you just having that shared language and the things that you've said today are going to help us all. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Please join us for drinks on Thursday if you're in and around London. If not, look out for future events. We're just working out what we're going to do in the autumn months. But yeah, all feedback, ideas. Thank you for joining us today. And yeah, keep connecting and talking as a group. It's beneficial for all. Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.